It was an ordinary Monday morning, and the office buzzed with the usual hum of employees rushing through their tasks. No one could have guessed that today would be the start of something that would shake the very foundation of the company. In the corner of the office, a new face sat quietly at a desk. He looked like any other middle-aged salesman, sharp suit, polished shoes, and an unassuming expression. But the truth was far from ordinary. This man was the CEO, now undercover to observe the very company he had spent years building. He had heard whispers of a toxic culture creeping through the ranks, and rumors of a particularly egregious salesman who had made his mark with a string of sexist comments. The CEO had decided it was time to see for himself. As he sat at his desk, observing the daily grind of the office, his eyes kept returning to one person, the salesman. There was something unsettling about the way he carried himself. He seemed to have no regard for the women in the office, often making demeaning remarks or dismissive gestures whenever they entered his vicinity. Today, however, something would happen that would force the CEO's hand. The salesman, a man known for his sharp tongue and cruel humor, was holding court in the break room, surrounded by a group of employees. His laughter echoed through the room, accompanied by a comment that made the CEO's blood run cold. "Women in sales? Don't make me laugh. They wouldn't know a deal if it hit them in the face." "It's a man's world," the salesman said, taking a long sip of his coffee as a few chuckles followed from his lackeys. The words stung like venom, and for a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The CEO's heart raced, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to blow his cover. He could feel his anger building, but he knew he had to be patient. The salesman continued, oblivious to the quiet tension that had settled into the air. "I mean, look at the new hires. They're out there trying to sell products they barely understand. It's laughable," he sneered. It wasn't just the words. It was the arrogance, the sheer disregard for basic human decency. The CEO clenched his fists under the desk, fighting the urge to stand up and confront the salesman then and there. This man, who had been allowed to roam free, had created an atmosphere of hostility. And in that moment, the CEO knew something had to be done. The office continued to buzz around him, but the CEO's thoughts were far away. He wasn't just thinking about this one salesman anymore, he was thinking about the impact of his actions on the women in the office, on the company as a whole. This wasn't just a case of one bad employee. It was a symptom of a deeper problem. But today, it would end. The CEO had already seen enough. The salesman's words were more than just a few inappropriate comments, they represented a pervasive culture that had taken root in the company. The CEO's decision was made in an instant. He would confront the salesman. He would expose him. And in doing so, he would finally take a stand for every employee who had been quietly suffering under the weight of his cruel behavior. The clock ticked on, but for the CEO, time had already stopped. This was no longer just about business, it was personal. He had seen the depths of the salesman's misogyny, and he couldn't allow it to continue any longer. What would happen next would shock the entire office, and ultimately, change the course of the company's future forever. The CEO knew that going undercover wouldn't be easy. For years, he had lived in the high-rise office with plush carpets, expensive suits, and endless meetings. His decisions shaped the company, but they came from behind a polished desk, far from the realities that his employees faced daily. Now, as an ordinary salesman in the trenches, he was experiencing everything firsthand, the pressure, the stress, and the occasional bitterness that filtered down from the top. But none of it bothered him as much as the toxic culture he had witnessed that morning. He had heard rumors, of course. Stories about how certain employees, especially the women, felt undermined or dismissed, how they struggled to be heard in a male-dominated environment. But the conversation in the break room had been the tipping point. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. The CEO had chosen the role of a salesman carefully. He wasn't just any salesperson, he was one of the newest hires. His task was to understand how the sales team interacted with clients, how they worked together, and most importantly, how they treated each other. He had spent weeks gathering intel, speaking to employees, observing everything from the small interactions to the big meetings. Yet, nothing compared to what he had overheard that morning. The salesman, the one whose words had burned into his mind, was a stark example of everything that had gone wrong in the company. This man was not just a misogynist, he was the embodiment of a toxic culture that needed to be eradicated. He didn't just make cruel jokes or belittle women, he actively sabotaged the careers of those who didn't fit his narrow view of who should succeed. And it wasn't just the women who suffered. His behavior had created an environment where people were afraid to speak up, where the fear of backlash kept many employees quiet. But what was the best course of action? The CEO had to think carefully. If he exposed the salesman without a plan, he risked creating even more chaos. He knew it wouldn't be enough to simply fire him. The salesman had too much influence in the office. His supporters were scattered among the sales teams, and without a well-thought-out strategy, taking direct action might backfire. The CEO decided to wait, to gather more evidence. He wasn't just going to confront the salesman and get rid of him, he was going to make sure that everyone understood the real problem and the long-term damage it had caused. There was more at play here than one man's behavior. He had to expose the roots of this toxic culture, and he needed proof that would leave no room for excuses. He began to pay closer attention to the way the employees interacted. It didn't take long for him to spot the patterns. The salesman, whom he had come to think of as a bully, wasn't the only problem. He was a symptom of the bigger issue, a company culture where disrespect and misogyny weren't just tolerated, they were ignored, even celebrated. Some employees, eager to fit in, laughed at the inappropriate jokes. Others, more silently, retreated into themselves, avoiding interactions with the salesman at all costs. The CEO's heart sank as he realized how deeply embedded this culture had become. Women in the office were taking longer lunch breaks, avoiding certain areas of the building, even asking for transfers to different departments, all to avoid crossing paths with the salesman and his allies. The atmosphere was poisonous, and it wasn't just the salesman's fault. This wasn't a workplace where everyone felt equal, where hard work and talent were rewarded regardless of gender. This was a place where power, intimidation, and prejudice ruled. It was clear that a deeper intervention was necessary. The CEO needed to confront the situation head-on, not just the salesman, but the entire culture that had been allowed to fester for too long. And so, his mission grew. He wasn't just going to be the CEO who fired a troublesome employee. He was going to be the CEO who cleaned up the entire company, who put an end to the toxic culture that had hurt so many people. As the day wore on, the CEO's resolve hardened. He knew what he had to do, but the task ahead of him was daunting. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. One wrong move, and he could lose the support of the very employees he hoped to protect. The pressure weighed heavily on him, but he also knew that change had to start now. And so, with a deep breath and a clear vision of the future, the CEO set his plan in motion. The time for action had arrived. The salesman had no idea what was coming next, but the CEO was prepared to expose him, and change everything in the process. As the days passed, the CEO settled deeper into his role, becoming more observant with every interaction. He made it a point to sit in on every sales meeting, to speak with as many employees as possible, quietly taking notes, observing the undercurrents of conversation, and listening for the unspoken truths. The more he observed, the more he realized that the problem was far worse than he had initially thought. The misogynistic salesman was not a lone wolf in a corporate jungle, he was part of a bigger, more insidious culture that had taken root over the years. The salesman, whom the CEO had once thought of as an isolated example of bad behavior, was simply a manifestation of a deeper issue that many of the employees had come to accept as normal. The toxic behavior was not limited to just one department or one person, it was woven into the fabric of the company's culture. The CEO began to hear whispers from both men and women alike, confiding in him about the things they had witnessed or endured, but had been too afraid to report. Women spoke about how their ideas were often dismissed in meetings, or how they had been passed over for promotions because they didn't fit the typical profile. Meanwhile, men recounted how the salesman manipulated situations to create divisions among colleagues, pitting employees against each other to maintain control. It was a web of subtle yet damaging behavior, all centered around the need to maintain a boys' club atmosphere where power and influence were reserved for a select few. What had been allowed to persist for so long was the belief that the company's success was tied to maintaining a facade of masculinity, where traditional gender roles were reinforced, and anything that deviated from this norm was either ignored or ridiculed. The CEO knew that he had to act, but he also knew that confronting the salesman head-on was not enough. This needed to be bigger than a single individual. It needed to be a wake-up call for the entire organization. He began to gather information, documenting the moments of discrimination, manipulation, and the passive complicity of those who allowed the culture to persist. Each new conversation revealed more stories of frustration, fear, and the quiet suffering of employees who had felt powerless to speak up. One afternoon, as the CEO sat in the break room, a conversation between two employees caught his attention. A woman, visibly upset, spoke to her coworker, who was a man with whom she had worked closely for years. "I just don't get it. He's always putting me down, telling me I'm not cut out for sales, that I'm too emotional to close deals. And you know what? Everyone just laughs like it's a joke. But it's not funny anymore. I feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells." Her words echoed in the CEO's mind as he listened carefully. She wasn't alone. Many of the women in the office had experienced similar treatment, though it was often brushed off as just a joke or part of the job. But it wasn't just the women who felt the sting of this toxic masculinity. The men who did not fit the stereotype of the aggressive, dominant salesman were often marginalized as well, treated like outsiders by their more vocal colleagues. The CEO realized that the environment the salesman had helped to create wasn't just about sexism, it was about fear. Fear of speaking out, fear of not fitting in, and fear of the consequences of challenging the status quo. The realization was sobering. This wasn't just about one bad employee or one insensitive remark. This was about a systemic issue, one that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. The salesman was not the sole villain, he was the product of a broken system, and it was a system that needed to be dismantled. The CEO spent the next several days preparing himself for the confrontation that was inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew that simply confronting the salesman wasn't enough. He had to address the culture as a whole. This was no longer just about getting rid of one person, it was about changing the way the company viewed itself, the way it treated its employees, and the way it held people accountable. He began to draft a plan, knowing full well that it would be a delicate process. If he moved too quickly, he risked losing the support of the staff. If he moved too slowly, the problem would only continue to grow. But one thing was certain, this would be the defining moment of his leadership. The stakes had never been higher. The CEO's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was time. The salesman had come to his office, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The CEO looked up, his gaze sharp and determined. This was the moment. Everything he had learned, everything he had witnessed, was about to culminate in a confrontation that would forever change the company's future. The CEO sat at his desk, his hands resting lightly on the papers before him, feeling the weight of what was about to unfold. His thoughts raced through the moments he had spent undercover, the disturbing conversations he had overheard, and the stories that had surfaced. Now, the salesman was sitting just across from him, unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. "Good afternoon," the salesman said casually, a smug smile on his face. He had no idea that the man sitting across from him, the new hire he had brushed off so easily, was the very person he had been unknowingly insulting for weeks. The CEO kept his expression neutral, maintaining the facade. Afternoon. I wanted to talk to you about a few things, if you have the time, he said, his voice calm, though underneath, he could feel the rising tension. He had spent weeks observing the salesman, studying his behavior, and now it was time to confront him head-on. The salesman leaned back in his chair, his hands resting behind his head, clearly confident. Of course, anything. What's on your mind? He sounded dismissive, like he didn't expect any real challenge. He was used to being the one in control, the one who set the tone. The CEO took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. I've been paying attention, he began, his tone steady but firm. I've seen how you interact with the team. I've heard what you've been saying about the women in the office, the comments you've made about their abilities. And I've watched how you've manipulated situations to pit people against each other. The salesman's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he quickly regained his composure. What are you talking about? I'm just trying to motivate people, to push them to do their best, he said, his voice a little too casual. But the CEO wasn't fooled. He had seen enough, heard enough, to know the truth. Motivation, he repeated, leaning forward slightly. I don't think that's what it is. I think you've been creating an atmosphere of fear and disrespect, where people feel like they have to walk on eggshells to avoid offending you. Where women in this company are afraid to speak up, to be taken seriously because of the way you treat them. The salesman's eyes narrowed, his earlier confidence slipping as he realized that the conversation was not going the way he expected. You've got it all wrong. They're just sensitive, too emotional for the real world of sales, he snapped, clearly uncomfortable. If they can't handle a little tough talk, maybe they don't belong here. The CEO's heart raced, but he remained calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now. You don't get it, do you? He said, his voice low but powerful. This isn't about being tough or real world. This is about creating an environment where everyone can thrive, regardless of gender or personal background. What you're doing here is damaging to everyone, men and women alike. You've built a culture where people are afraid to be themselves, where they feel like they have to follow your example or be silenced. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the tension between them. The salesman, for the first time, seemed unsure. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The CEO knew this was his chance to push further. You've created an office where women are forced to fight for recognition, where their contributions are minimized. And I've seen it with my own eyes. I've talked to employees, people who were too scared to speak up, too intimidated to confront you. But now, it's time for that to change. The salesman swallowed hard, but he didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, trying to find a way out of this. His usual tactics of manipulation and belittling weren't working this time. The CEO's calm resolve had taken him by surprise. I've already seen the damage you've done, the CEO continued. And I've been documenting it. I'll make sure this isn't swept under the rug. You don't get to hide behind your charm or your position anymore. This is bigger than you. The culture you've helped build here, it's toxic. And it's going to end today. The salesman was now visibly sweating, his confident posture shattered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for some way to salvage the situation. But it was too late. You're fired, the CEO said, his voice final, his decision unwavering. And I'll make sure that everyone knows why. The salesman's face turned red, his eyes flashing with anger and disbelief. You can't do this, he spat. I've worked here for years. You don't know what you're talking about. But the CEO didn't flinch. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not just firing you for your actions. I'm doing this to send a message to the rest of the company. This behavior will not be tolerated, not anymore. The salesman stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He shot the CEO a venomous look, but the CEO didn't flinch. He knew what needed to be done. As the salesman stormed out of the office, the CEO let out a long, slow breath. The confrontation was over, but the battle had only just begun. The damage had been done, but the CEO was determined to fix it. He couldn't change everything in one conversation, but this was a start. The real work would come later, when he would have to rebuild the culture, piece by piece. The CEO sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment sinking in. He had done the right thing, but he couldn't help but wonder, was this just the beginning of something bigger? The storm was far from over, but at least now, the first domino had fallen. The CEO sat alone in his office, the aftermath of the confrontation still fresh in his mind. He had fired the salesman, but even in the silence of the room, he could feel the ripples of the decision. He knew he had done the right thing, but the weight of what came next hung heavily in the air. The office would change, but how would it change? And who would rise to fill the void the salesman had left behind? What the CEO didn't anticipate was how quickly the backlash would come. It started innocuously enough. A few employees, mostly men who had long been sympathetic to the salesman's behavior, started to approach the CEO with vague complaints about how things had gone too far. They didn't directly challenge the CEO's authority, at least not at first, but the tension in the air was palpable. The CEO wasn't naive enough to think that firing someone with such influence in the office would be met with unanimous approval. What surprised him, though, was how quickly the salesman's supporters came together, rallying around the idea that the CEO was overstepping his boundaries, that he had unfairly targeted one of their own. One afternoon, a group of employees, including a few from the sales team, arrived at the CEO's office. They didn't announce themselves, but the cold silence that followed their arrival told the CEO everything he needed to know. They stood just inside the doorway, their expressions hard, but their words were anything but direct. "You've made a big mistake," one of them finally said, his voice quiet but steady. The CEO recognized him as one of the salesman's most vocal supporters. "You've taken things too far. People are talking. The way you handled this, it's not right." The CEO remained calm. He had expected resistance, but this felt different. The group wasn't just questioning his actions, they were subtly challenging his leadership. He leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to make things right," the CEO replied. His voice was firm, but there was a quiet sadness in it, too. "What's been happening here, in this office, can't continue. You know that. This is bigger than one man. It's about the kind of company we want to be." The group exchanged glances, but no one responded immediately. The tension in the room thickened, and the CEO began to feel the weight of his position. He was no longer just a leader of a company, he was now the figurehead of change, a change that was going to cost him. What he hadn't anticipated was the speed with which his decisions would fracture the company. The salesman had many allies, and their loyalty wasn't something the CEO had accounted for. He had expected some pushback, but the coordinated nature of this resistance surprised him. It wasn't just about defending the salesman, it was about defending an outdated culture that had persisted for far too long. Over the next few days, more employees voiced their concerns, some in hushed tones in the hallway, others more openly. The CEO knew that if he didn't address the growing unease, it would spread like wildfire. He needed to regain control of the narrative and rebuild trust. He had acted decisively, but now, he had to show that the decision wasn't a personal vendetta, it was a necessary step toward creating a better, more inclusive environment. But things weren't as simple as he'd hoped. The salesman, though fired, wasn't entirely out of the picture. In a shocking turn of events, the CEO learned that the salesman had contacted several influential figures within the company, stirring up trouble and sowing doubt about the CEO's leadership. He was framing the firing as an overreaction, as an attack on the strong sales culture that had driven the company's success for years. He had managed to convince a number of key figures that the CEO's actions were a threat to the very foundation of the company. The CEO's phone rang late one night, an unknown number. He picked it up, already knowing who it was. "Did you really think you could get rid of me that easily?" The salesman's voice was smooth, almost mocking. "I've worked here longer than you've been CEO. You don't understand how things work around here. I'm not the problem. You are." The words hit the CEO like a slap in the face. The salesman wasn't just trying to protect his own reputation, he was trying to destroy the CEO's. This was a personal attack, and it was only the beginning. The salesman's influence over the office, his ability to manipulate and sow division, was more entrenched than the CEO had ever realized. The CEO sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the situation sink in. He had thought that removing the salesman from the equation would solve everything, but now he saw that the true battle wasn't about firing one employee. It was about dismantling a culture that had been built over years, a culture that had seeped into the very fabric of the company. The confrontation had triggered something far more complicated than he had anticipated. The salesman's departure was only the first step in a much larger fight, one that would take more than just firing a few bad apples. This was about changing hearts and minds, about reshaping a company that had long turned a blind eye to its own toxic undercurrents. The CEO had made a bold move, but he now understood that the consequences would be far-reaching. He couldn't afford to back down now. The storm was far from over, and the CEO had no choice but to brace himself for what was coming next. The following days felt like a blur for the CEO. What had begun as a simple act of justice, firing a toxic employee, had snowballed into something far more complicated. It wasn't just about confronting one man anymore, it was about taking on a culture that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. The salesman, now on the offensive, had turned what was supposed to be a moment of clarity into a battle for the company's soul. The CEO had made a strong decision, but it wasn't being accepted by everyone. The ripple effect of the firing spread throughout the office, creating divisions among employees. Those who had supported the salesman were emboldened by his return to the shadows. They started whispering, questioning the CEO's authority, and rallying against the changes he was trying to bring about. The sense of unity that the CEO had hoped for was now fractured, and the office felt colder, more divided than ever before. One morning, the CEO stood in front of the office building, looking up at the towering structure that represented years of hard work and vision. But now, he was starting to see the cracks. His company was a reflection of him, a place where he had poured his heart and soul. But like every great empire, it had its flaws, and it was becoming clear that the foundations were more fragile than he had ever realized. The CEO's phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. A meeting was scheduled with his executive team. As he entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. There were no pleasantries, just a heavy silence as his team took their seats. The CEO scanned the room, noticing the subtle change in body language. Some of the people who had always supported him now seemed distant. Others looked uncomfortable, unsure of where they stood. "Let's get to the point," the CEO said, cutting through the tension. "I'm hearing that there's a lot of discomfort around my decision to fire the salesman. I need to know what's really going on here." A senior executive, who had been with the company for nearly 2 decades, spoke first. "There's a lot of unrest. You've created a situation where people are questioning your leadership. Many feel like you acted too quickly, without considering the full consequences." The executive's tone was careful, as though choosing his words with precision. "I didn't make this decision lightly," the CEO replied, his voice steady but growing more frustrated. "This wasn't just about one bad employee. This is about the kind of company we want to be moving forward. A company that values respect and equality for everyone. If that's causing discomfort, then maybe it's because the culture needed to change. Another executive, this time from the HR department, chimed in. I understand the need for change, but the way you went about it has raised a lot of questions. The salesman had powerful allies, and now we're facing a backlash. Some of these people have been with us for years. They feel betrayed, and that's creating a rift. The CEO felt a pang of regret. He had thought he could handle this on his own, but now it was clear that the situation was more complex than he had imagined. The salesman had created more than just an issue with one person. He had built a network of supporters who saw his actions as part of a larger power structure. This wasn't just a matter of firing a single employee, it was about dismantling an entire network of influence within the company. The CEO's gaze shifted to a younger executive, one who had been part of the team for only a few years but had quickly earned the CEO's trust. What do you think? He asked, his voice softer now. Do you think I made a mistake? The young executive took a deep breath before responding. I don't think you made a mistake. The salesman was bad for the company. But you've got to realize that the culture here doesn't change overnight. The people who are upset aren't just mad about the firing, they're mad about the fact that they've been complicit in allowing things to go on for so long. And now they feel like they're being forced to pick a side. The CEO absorbed this, realizing the truth in her words. The employees weren't just upset by the firing, they were grappling with their own roles in perpetuating a toxic environment. It was easier to side with the salesman, to justify his actions, than to confront the reality that they too had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. The room fell silent as the CEO processed this. He had underestimated the power of complacency in the office. It wasn't just about confronting the salesman, it was about confronting a mindset that had become ingrained in the company's culture. I understand, the CEO said quietly. This is a bigger issue than one man. It's about the company's future and the values we stand for. But I won't let this go. I'll work with all of you to fix this, but we need to be honest with ourselves about what's been allowed to happen here. The executives nodded, and the tension in the room seemed to ease just slightly. The CEO knew that the road ahead was going to be long and difficult. The change he had started would require more than just removing toxic individuals, it would require a complete overhaul of the office culture, and the road to that change would be bumpy. But the CEO wasn't backing down. He had made the decision to confront the issue, and now there was no turning back. The office, and the company, would either evolve, or they would crumble. The CEO was determined to ensure the former. As the meeting adjourned, the CEO stood up, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had to rebuild trust, not just in his leadership, but in the company's ability to change. And he had to start from the ground up. The CEO had spent days trying to find the right approach to mend the rift in the company. He had spoken to employees individually, he had attended meetings, and he had listened to their concerns. But nothing seemed to make a difference. The division between those who supported the salesman and those who wanted change was too wide, too entrenched. It was clear now, the only way forward was a final, public showdown. He knew he couldn't let the status quo persist any longer. The culture that had allowed misogyny and manipulation to thrive had to be uprooted, and the first step was confronting the full extent of it in front of the entire company. No more behind-the-scenes discussions. It was time for transparency, for accountability. The CEO arranged a company-wide meeting. The date was set, and the tension in the office leading up to it was almost unbearable. Rumors circulated, some said he would announce a new direction for the company, others speculated that he would clean house, firing more employees. But no one knew for sure. The CEO had kept his cards close to his chest, knowing that this meeting would be the most important one of his career. As the day approached, the CEO began preparing his speech. It wasn't easy. The words had to be carefully chosen, not just to convey his message, but to unite a fractured team. He had no illusions that everyone would agree with him, but he needed them to understand the stakes. He needed them to see the bigger picture, the company's future, and how their actions today would shape it. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. The conference room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Employees shuffled in, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and even resentment. The CEO stood at the front of the room, his expression calm, but underneath, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. As the room quieted, the CEO began to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of leadership behind it. I know there's been a lot of uncertainty in the past few weeks, he began, looking around the room. I know there's been confusion, frustration, and anger. But we cannot move forward until we confront the truth. The CEO paused for a moment, letting the silence settle around him. What happened with the salesman wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the culture we have allowed to fester here. A culture where toxic behavior was tolerated, where people were afraid to speak up, where discrimination was ignored in the name of salesmanship and results. That stops today. The room was eerily silent, and the CEO could feel the weight of his words sinking in. The resistance, the murmurs of discontent, were still there, but he wasn't backing down. I know that many of you have worked alongside him for years, the CEO continued. You knew him, and you trusted him. But his actions, his words, they were not just a personal failing. They were a reflection of a system that had allowed behavior like this to thrive. We've all been complicit in allowing this to happen. It wasn't just him. It was all of us. The CEO could feel the tension building. He knew he was pushing them, but it was necessary. The hard truth had to be told. But let me be clear, he said, his voice rising slightly. This is not just about one person. This is about the future of this company. If we are going to succeed, we need to be a place where respect is the foundation of everything we do. A place where every single employee, regardless of their gender, their background, or their role, feels valued and heard. There was a murmur from the crowd, and the CEO could see some faces beginning to soften, some people nodding in agreement. He wasn't winning everyone over, but he was making progress. I am not asking for perfection, the CEO continued, his tone more measured. I'm asking for commitment. Commitment to change. Commitment to each other. We will rebuild the trust that has been broken. But it starts with us. Right here. Right now. The CEO's words hung in the air as he scanned the room. He could see the skepticism in some faces, but he also saw the glimmer of understanding in others. This wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead would be long, and the obstacles were many. But the CEO was resolute. He had taken the first step, and now it was time for the company to take the next. As the meeting concluded, the CEO walked out of the room, his mind racing with the weight of what had just transpired. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew the real work was just beginning. The change would not come overnight. It would take time, patience, and commitment from every single person in that room. But if the company was going to survive, if it was going to thrive, this was the moment it had to change. The showdown was over, but the fight was far from finished. The days following the CEO's speech were filled with a strange sense of calm and chaos interwoven. The initial shock of his words had settled into a new rhythm within the company. The employees, still digesting the powerful speech, seemed to be divided into two distinct groups, those who were genuinely moved and eager for change, and those who, though outwardly compliant, still clung to the old ways. The CEO had expected some pushback, but what came next was something he had never predicted. The salesman, despite being fired and cast out of the office, was far from defeated. He had connections, both inside and outside the company, and he wasn't about to let his downfall go unnoticed. Within days, the CEO was bombarded with messages, mostly from allies of the salesman, who questioned his leadership and cast doubts on the integrity of his decisions. The salesman's supporters had begun to organize behind the scenes, spreading the narrative that the CEO's actions were not about creating a better work environment, but rather about personal power. They painted the CEO as a man who had become intoxicated by his role, willing to sacrifice the company's long-standing culture for the sake of his ego. It wasn't long before these whispers began to grow louder. Office gossip shifted from excitement about the changes the CEO had promised to skepticism about his true intentions. Employees began to wonder if the CEO had another agenda, perhaps one that had nothing to do with their well-being. Doubts began to seep into the office like a slow poison. The CEO was not blind to the shifting atmosphere. He knew the salesman's departure had created a power vacuum in the office, but he hadn't anticipated how swiftly that void would be filled by doubt. And then, just when he thought the situation couldn't get worse, the unexpected happened. The CEO received an anonymous email, one that would turn everything he thought he knew upside down. The email was from someone inside the company, someone close to the salesman, who claimed to have evidence that the salesman had been planning his exit long before the CEO had even thought of confronting him. The email revealed that the salesman had been in talks with a rival company, negotiating a deal to sell insider information and weaken the company's position. His behavior wasn't just about misogyny or toxic masculinity, it was part of a calculated effort to undermine the company from within. The CEO's blood ran cold as he read through the email. The salesman had been using his influence not just to protect his own position, but to destroy the company he had worked for. This wasn't just personal betrayal, it was corporate sabotage. The realization hit hard. The CEO had thought he was dealing with a toxic employee, a man who needed to be removed for the sake of the company's culture. But in reality, the salesman's actions were part of a larger, more dangerous game. He had been working to dismantle the very foundation the CEO had spent years building. But even more unsettling was the knowledge that this information had been kept secret for so long. The email hinted that there were others who knew about the salesman's activities but had kept quiet, either out of fear or out of loyalty to him. This was no longer just about a culture of misogyny. It was about a group of people who had enabled this man's actions, turning a blind eye to the damage he was causing. The CEO now had to make a choice. How far was he willing to go to expose the full truth? He could confront the employees who had known about the salesman's betrayal, but doing so could destroy what little trust he had left within the company. Or he could keep this information to himself, risking the possibility that the salesman's plan would succeed in the long run. As the days passed, the CEO knew he could not keep this secret any longer. The company's survival depended on rooting out the corruption that had allowed the salesman's scheme to flourish. The CEO called for another meeting with the executive team, this time with a very different agenda. He wasn't going to let the salesman's betrayal remain hidden. This time, he was going to expose the full extent of the damage. When the executives gathered in the conference room, they could sense the gravity in the air. The CEO was no longer the man who had fired one employee for his behavior. Now, he was a man on a mission to protect the company he loved from a threat far greater than he had ever imagined. "We've been blind," the CEO began, his voice heavy with resolve. What we thought was a simple issue of toxic behavior was, in fact, a calculated effort to destroy this company from within. The salesman, he wasn't just causing problems with his actions. He was orchestrating a plan to sell out the company to a rival. The room was silent as the gravity of his words settled in. The executives exchanged shocked glances, and the CEO knew that things would never be the same again. The company had been infiltrated in ways they couldn't have imagined, and now the true work of rebuilding would have to begin. But it wasn't just about cleaning house, it was about unearthing every betrayal, exposing every hidden influence, and ensuring that the company would never again be vulnerable to sabotage from within. For the first time since the initial confrontation with the salesman, the CEO felt a sense of clarity. The fight was far from over. But now, he was armed with the knowledge he needed to make sure that the company would not only survive, but thrive in the face of the betrayal that had almost destroyed it. The days after the meeting with his executive team were filled with chaos. The CEO had uncovered a network of betrayal that spanned far beyond the salesman. It became clear that what he had thought was a simple matter of toxic workplace behavior was, in reality, a systemic issue. The salesman, as it turned out, had not acted alone. He had cultivated a small group of loyalists within the company, those who had benefited from the toxic culture, and together they had tried to take the company down from within. The CEO was determined to act. He called for a company-wide meeting, but this time, it wasn't just to announce changes. This was about transparency, accountability, and learning from the mistakes that had nearly cost them everything. It was a moment of reckoning for the company, a chance to rebuild and, perhaps, to forge a new identity. As the employees gathered in the meeting room, the CEO stood before them, looking out at the faces of people who had, until recently, been divided. Some of them still looked skeptical, others weary, but the CEO knew this moment was crucial. He needed to not only explain what had happened but also help them understand why they needed to change. Not for him, not for the company's survival, but for themselves. For the future of the workplace they had built. Last week, I told you that things had to change, the CEO began, his voice steady but with a gravity that filled the room. But today, I'm going to tell you why it matters. We are not just here to work. We are here to create something better than what we had before. The company that almost crumbled under the weight of our complacency can rise again, but only if we learn from what we've done, what we've allowed, and what we can do better moving forward. He paused, giving the room time to absorb his words. What happened with the salesman wasn't just a betrayal of me, it was a betrayal of all of us. But the real betrayal was the culture that allowed him to thrive for so long. We tolerated an environment where people, especially women, were not valued equally. We allowed an environment where manipulation and fear kept people from speaking up. And for too long, we didn't listen when people tried to tell us that something was wrong. The CEO's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. No one spoke. There was no defensiveness, no more reluctance. The company was at a crossroads, and everyone knew it. We're not going to pretend that everything is fine. We've got work to do, the CEO continued. But we can't undo the damage we've caused by ignoring the warning signs. We can only move forward by committing to change, by committing to each other. Every single person here is integral to the future of this company. And that starts with creating an environment where respect and fairness are non-negotiable. The room was quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with understanding. The CEO had hit a chord. He wasn't just telling them what to do, he was showing them the way forward, not as a leader giving commands, but as a human being asking for their trust. I'm not asking for perfection, he said. I'm asking for commitment. I'm asking each of you to be honest with yourselves, to call out toxic behavior when you see it, and to build an environment where everyone can thrive. That means supporting each other, challenging each other, and doing what's right, even when it's difficult. As the CEO finished speaking, there was a shift in the room. People were looking at each other, not with suspicion or resentment, but with a shared understanding. This was the beginning of something new, something they could all be a part of. The CEO had no illusions, it would take time. But this meeting, this moment, was the catalyst for change. The CEO knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments of doubt, times when old habits resurfaced, and some employees who would never embrace the changes. But he had seen something in the room today, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Hope that they could rebuild together. Hope that they could create a new company culture, one based on respect, integrity, and fairness. The meeting ended quietly, but the CEO felt a sense of calm that had eluded him for weeks. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a leader who had made the difficult decisions, who had confronted uncomfortable truths, and who had guided his team through the storm. The company would rise from the ashes of its past. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Because at the heart of it all, the CEO had learned the most important lesson of all: change doesn't come from one person making a decision. It comes from a collective effort, a shared commitment to do better, to be better, and to ensure that everyone has a place at the table. And with that, the CEO knew that the future was bright. The battle wasn't over, but they were finally on the right path.